Sometimes the most important person in the building is the one nobody bothers to learn the name of. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, spilling polished executives into the marble lobby of Atlas Dynamics, where expensive shoes clicked across gleaming floors and conversations about mergers, quarterly forecasts, and billion-dollar contracts floated through the cool morning air. Near the revolving entrance stood Ethan Brooks, holding a neatly organized folder that had clearly been opened and closed too many times. His navy jacket had been pressed with care, but the fabric had begun to show its age, and the brown leather shoes he wore had been polished so often that the creases had become impossible to hide. He wasn't there to interview for an executive position. He wasn't hoping to impress anyone with an extraordinary resume. He was applying for a janitor's job. At exactly 8:05 a.m., the receptionist looked up with a polite but distracted smile before glancing down at his application. Her expression changed almost immediately. "Janitorial services are downstairs," she said, assuming he must have been lost. Ethan simply nodded. "That's exactly why I'm here." She handed him a visitor badge without another question, already turning her attention toward a sharply dressed consultant carrying a leather briefcase worth more than Ethan's entire monthly rent. Nobody noticed the quiet father standing patiently beside the front desk. Nobody noticed the wedding ring no longer resting on his finger. Nobody noticed the faint crayon mark near the edge of his folder where his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, had accidentally decorated it while doing homework the night before. Inside that folder sat references, certifications, and a work history so unexpectedly impressive that most people would have questioned why he had walked through the wrong doors. But Ethan had carefully removed several pages before arriving. He wasn't searching for recognition anymore. He was searching for stability. Rent was due in 6 days. Lily needed new glasses before school started in 3 weeks. The refrigerator at home held exactly enough groceries to last until Saturday if they stretched every meal. Pride couldn't pay utility bills, and memories couldn't keep the lights on. A young hiring coordinator appeared, barely older than 25, carrying a digital tablet and an impatient expression. "Mr. Brooks?" Ethan stood immediately. "Follow me." They walked through a hallway lined with framed photographs celebrating Atlas Dynamics' rise from a modest startup into one of America's most admired technology companies. Employees smiled proudly from every picture, while awards shimmered beneath carefully positioned lights. Ethan's eyes lingered on one photograph for barely a second before he quietly looked away, almost as though he recognized something nobody else ever would. The coordinator noticed his glance and chuckled lightly. "Pretty amazing history, huh? People would do anything to have their name on one of these walls." Ethan answered with the smallest smile. "Sometimes history costs more than people realize." The coordinator barely heard him. As they reached the interview room, several employees passing by exchanged quick looks. One whispered, "Guess we're hiring janitors again." Another laughed softly. "Hope he knows how to use a mop." Ethan heard every word, yet his expression never changed. He simply adjusted the family photo tucked carefully inside his folder, where Lily smiled with 2 missing front teeth beneath a handwritten note that read, "You always fix everything, Dad." For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't trying to fix the past. He was only trying to build tomorrow. Upstairs, on the 42nd floor, Billionaire CEO Charlotte Hayes stepped out of her private elevator carrying a stack of personnel files that required her signature before the board meeting. She signed the first, then the second, then her pen suddenly stopped above a simple application for a janitor. Her eyes froze on one name, Ethan Brooks. Ethan settled into the plain chair across from the hiring coordinator without a trace of nervousness, folding his hands quietly over the worn folder that had carried every important chapter of his life. The interview room was small, bright, and spotless, with a single window overlooking downtown Chicago where glass towers reflected the morning sun. The coordinator glanced at the application for only a few seconds before speaking. "You understand this is an entry-level custodial position. The work includes cleaning offices, emptying trash, mopping floors, and handling overnight maintenance when necessary." Ethan nodded once. "I understand." The coordinator looked at him again, puzzled by the calm confidence that did not seem to belong in someone applying for the lowest position in the building. "You have experience in facilities management?" Ethan smiled gently. "I have experience taking care of what matters." The answer earned a confused look instead of appreciation. The coordinator tapped his tablet impatiently. Can you operate commercial floor equipment? Yes. Can you lift 50 pounds? Yes. Can you work weekends? If it helps provide for my daughter, I can work whenever I am needed. For a brief moment, the room became quiet. The coordinator glanced toward the family photo tucked inside the folder. A little girl with bright eyes smiled back at the camera while holding a handmade science fair ribbon. She is your daughter? Ethan's expression softened immediately. Her name is Lily. She believes I can fix almost anything. Can you? Ethan looked out the window before answering. Not everything, but I always try. The hiring coordinator cleared his throat and returned to the application. Several sections seemed unusually incomplete. Employment dates ended years earlier. Major achievements were missing. References had been reduced to only 2 names. It looked less like an impressive career and more like someone carefully hiding one. Outside the conference room, 2 employees passed by carrying coffee cups. One peeked through the glass wall and quietly laughed. He looks overdressed for a janitor. The other shrugged, probably desperate. Their voices faded down the hallway, but every word reached Ethan's ears. He remained perfectly still. He had learned long ago that dignity did not argue with disrespect. It simply outlasted it. Upstairs, Charlotte Hayes remained frozen over the application resting on her desk. She read the name again, then slowly opened the attached digital employment archive that Human Resources had barely reviewed. Most of the record had been simplified, but one archived document remained hidden beneath older company files. Her breathing slowed. 12 years earlier, before she had become chief executive officer, before Atlas Dynamics had expanded across the country, there had been whispers about a brilliant systems architect whose designs had transformed the company during its earliest years. He had disappeared without asking for recognition, without cashing in stock options, and without leaving behind more than a short resignation letter. Charlotte had spent years wondering why someone capable of changing an entire industry would simply walk away. She touched the screen lightly, staring at the quiet photograph attached to the old employee profile. The younger face carried more color, fewer lines, but the same calm eyes she had seen only minutes earlier on the security camera. Downstairs, the hiring coordinator closed the folder and stood. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Human Resources will make a decision after executive approval. Ethan rose with a grateful smile. Thank you for your time. As he walked toward the door, neither man noticed the notification that had just appeared on the coordinator's tablet. It contained only 7 words from the office of the chief executive officer. Send Mr. Brooks nowhere. Bring him directly to me. The hiring coordinator frowned at the unexpected message, reading it twice before looking back at Ethan with visible confusion. A moment earlier, he had been preparing the usual polite rejection reserved for applicants who would probably never hear another word. Now the instructions came directly from the highest office in the company, carrying a level of urgency that made no sense at all. Mr. Brooks, he said carefully, there has been a small change of plans. The chief executive officer would like to meet you personally. Ethan blinked once, surprised but composed. There must be some mistake. I thought the same thing, the coordinator admitted with an uneasy laugh. But the request came directly from her office. They stepped into the hallway together, where employees slowed their pace just enough to watch the unusual scene unfold. Nobody could remember the last time a janitorial applicant had been escorted toward the executive elevators. Quiet whispers followed them through the polished corridors. Is he related to someone? One employee wondered. Another shook his head. Maybe the company is filming some kind of promotional video. Ethan ignored every curious glance. Years earlier, attention had followed him everywhere he went. Today, anonymity felt far more comfortable. The private elevator climbed silently toward the 42nd floor. Soft instrumental music drifted through hidden speakers while the digital display counted upward 1 floor at a time. Ethan watched the numbers without speaking. Reflected in the brushed steel doors, he noticed a few more gray strands around his temples than he remembered. Time had changed his appearance, but not the quiet steadiness in his eyes. When the elevator doors opened, the atmosphere felt entirely different from the busy lobby below. Thick carpets softened every footstep. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the skyline, where Lake Michigan shimmered beneath the late morning sun. The air carried the faint scent of fresh coffee and cedarwood. Outside the executive office, Charlotte Hayes stood alone with Ethan's original employee file resting open in her hands. She had canceled 2 investor calls without explanation. Every page, she answered one old question while creating 10 new ones. She remembered being a young project manager 12 years earlier, watching engineers speak about Ethan Brooks with the kind of respect usually reserved for legends. They said he could solve impossible problems simply by asking better questions. They said he never chased promotions, never competed for recognition, and never stayed long enough to celebrate success. Then one ordinary Friday afternoon, he disappeared. No farewell party, no press release, no interview. Only a brief resignation letter thanking Atlas Dynamics for believing in ideas before they became profitable. Charlotte had kept a copy of that letter in her personal files ever since. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant stepped inside. "Mr. Brooks is here." Charlotte closed the folder slowly and took one quiet breath before answering. "Please send him in." The office door opened. Ethan stepped across the threshold with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the morning. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence held no discomfort. Only recognition carried across more than a decade. Charlotte studied the familiar face, now marked by loss, responsibility, and quiet endurance. Ethan looked around the office, noticing the same company logo that had once existed only as a simple sketch inside a rented warehouse. Finally, Charlotte smiled, though her eyes had already begun to glisten. "Welcome back, Mr. Brooks," she said softly. Ethan looked genuinely puzzled. "I am sorry," he replied with complete sincerity. "Have we met before?" Charlotte let out the smallest breath of disbelief. After 12 years of searching for the man who had helped build the foundation beneath one of the largest technology companies in America, she realized something astonishing. The only person in the room who seemed unaware of his own importance was the man standing quietly in front of her. Charlotte slowly set the old personnel file on her desk, never taking her eyes off Ethan. The silence between them carried the weight of years rather than awkwardness. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was almost gentle. "Perhaps I should introduce myself again. I was a junior project manager when you were here. Charlotte Hayes." Ethan searched his memory for a brief moment before offering an apologetic smile. "I remember the name now. You always stayed late after everyone else had gone home." Charlotte laughed softly, surprised that he remembered such a small detail. "You noticed that?" Ethan nodded. "People who work quietly are easier to remember than people who try to be noticed." The words settled over the office like warm sunlight. Outside the glass walls, assistants hurried through the executive floor preparing for meetings worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But inside the room, time seemed to slow. Charlotte opened the worn employee file once more. "Do you know that many of the systems running this company today still follow the architecture you designed?" Ethan lowered his eyes. "Technology belongs to the people who improve it. Nothing stays ours forever." She studied him carefully. 12 years had changed his appearance, but not the humility that older engineers still spoke about with admiration. Back then, Atlas Dynamics had occupied only 2 renovated warehouse floors on the edge of the city. There were no marble lobbies, no private elevators, and no global headquarters. Folding tables served as desks. Whiteboards covered nearly every wall. Coffee was brewed in a machine that seemed older than the company itself. Yet every evening, long after others had gone home, one desk remained lit. Ethan would sit surrounded by notebooks filled with careful sketches, searching for simpler ways to solve problems everyone else believed were impossible. He never raised his voice in meetings. He listened longer than anyone else. Then he would quietly ask one question that changed the direction of the entire discussion. Investors began trusting Atlas because its technology rarely failed. Clients stayed because the systems could grow without breaking. Few people knew whose ideas had made that possible because Ethan insisted every success belonged to the team instead of himself. Awards were accepted by executives. Magazine interviews featured founders. Ethan usually slipped out the side door before the cameras arrived. Charlotte remembered asking him once why he never cared about recognition. He had smiled and answered, "If the bridge holds, nobody applauds the engineer. They simply arrive home safely. That is enough." Then everything changed almost overnight. One Monday morning, his desk was empty. His access badge had been returned. His office plan had been given to another employee. The only thing left behind was a handwritten letter thanking everyone for believing in impossible ideas. Rumors spread for months. Some claimed another company had recruited him with an extraordinary salary. Others believed he had retired young after making a fortune. Nobody guessed the truth. Ethan looked toward the skyline beyond the windows before speaking quietly. My wife became very sick. Every day mattered more than every deadline. After she passed away, there was only Lily and me. She needed a father much more than this company needed another engineer. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. Suddenly, every unanswered question from the past found its answer in a single sentence. Ethan had not walked away because he stopped believing in the company. He had walked away because love had asked more of him than ambition ever could. She closed the file with both hands and looked at him with a respect deeper than admiration. At that very moment, her executive assistant hurried into the office, his face unusually pale. "Excuse me, Miss Hayes," he said carefully. "The entire engineering division has declared a critical systems failure, and none of our senior architects can identify the cause." Charlotte rose from her chair immediately, but before following her assistant, she looked back at Ethan with an expression that balanced urgency and quiet hope. "Would you mind waiting here for just a few minutes?" she asked. Ethan nodded politely. "Of course." The assistant hesitated before adding another detail. "The investors from California are already in the executive conference room. The demonstration starts in less than 40 minutes. Charlotte thanked him with a brief nod and stepped into the hallway. The executive floor, come only moments earlier, had transformed into a storm of hurried footsteps, ringing phones, and anxious voices. Large display screens flashed warning messages, while engineers rushed between offices carrying laptops and tablets. The company that prided itself on flawless reliability suddenly felt fragile. Ethan remained seated beside the window, listening to the distant rhythm of organized chaos without the slightest trace of satisfaction. He had seen moments like this before. Technology always rewarded preparation and punished pride. On the other side of the floor, Charlotte entered the engineering command center, where nearly 20 specialists surrounded an enormous digital dashboard filled with cascading system alerts. "Status?" she asked calmly. The chief technology officer rubbed his forehead. "Our cloud synchronization layer is rejecting authentication requests across multiple regions. We rolled back the latest update, but the failures continue. Every solution creates 2 new problems." Another senior engineer added, "If we cannot stabilize the platform before the investors arrive, the demonstration will fail. They are expecting to evaluate our next-generation infrastructure." Charlotte studied the scrolling diagnostics in silence. Something about the pattern felt strangely familiar, although she could not immediately explain why. One of the older engineers, a gray-haired architect named Richard Nolan, stepped closer to the display. He narrowed his eyes before quietly whispering, almost to himself, "This structure. I have seen this before." Charlotte turned toward him. "What do you mean?" Richard looked at the system map with growing disbelief. "These core modules still follow the original adaptive framework. There was only one person who truly understood every layer because he designed the foundation himself." The room fell noticeably quieter. Several younger engineers exchanged puzzled looks. They had heard stories about the mysterious architect from the company's earliest years, but most believed he had become little more than corporate folklore. Richard continued, "When we built this platform, he insisted every shortcut would become tomorrow's emergency. We thought he was overly cautious." He smiled sadly. Turns out he was simply thinking 10 years ahead. Charlotte did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked through the glass wall toward her office where Ethan still sat alone, patiently waiting exactly as she had requested. He was not pacing. He was not asking questions. He was not trying to prove who he had once been. He simply noticed a small indoor plant near the window beginning to lean away from the sunlight. Quietly, he stood, rotated the pot a few inches, and returned to his chair. Such a small gesture somehow reminded Charlotte of every story she had ever heard about him. He solved problems because they needed solving, not because anyone was watching. She made her decision. Walking back into the command center, she spoke with calm certainty that immediately silenced every conversation. "Prepare a temporary visitor badge with unrestricted engineering access." The chief technology officer stared at her in confusion. "For whom?" Charlotte answered without hesitation. "For the janitor applicant sitting in my office." A few uncertain laughs echoed across the room before fading when they realized she was completely serious. Richard Nolan slowly smiled, his eyes brightening with something that looked remarkably like relief. "If that visitor is Ethan Brooks," he said quietly, "then for the first time this morning, I believe we actually have a chance." Richard Nolan personally escorted Ethan through a secured hallway that overlooked the engineering operations center below. Behind the glass walls, dozens of specialists moved from workstation to workstation while enormous displays filled with warning icons reflected across anxious faces. The atmosphere carried the quiet pressure that always settled over people responsible for protecting something much larger than themselves. Ethan accepted the temporary access badge without looking at the title printed beneath his name. Visitor. It made no difference to him. Charlotte walked beside him at an even pace. "I want to be clear," she said. "I am not asking you to fix this. You came here looking for honest work, and I will respect that. I simply hoped you might be willing to take a look." Ethan offered the same calm smile that had never seemed to leave him. Looking costs nothing. They entered the command center, and every conversation stopped. Younger engineers stared curiously at the quiet applicant wearing an inexpensive jacket, while senior managers struggled to understand why the chief executive officer had personally escorted him inside. One engineer leaned toward another and whispered, "Is this some outside consultant?" The reply came just as softly, "No. Human Resources said he applied to be a janitor." Several puzzled expressions appeared across the room. Ethan noticed them, but said nothing. Charlotte introduced him with remarkable simplicity. "This is Mr. Ethan Brooks." Richard Nolan added only 4 more words. "Please let him think." Nobody understood why the veteran architect spoke with such quiet confidence. Ethan stepped toward the enormous system display without touching a keyboard. His eyes moved slowly across network diagrams, timing graphs, authentication logs, and cloud synchronization reports. He did not rush. He did not interrupt. He simply watched. Nearly a full minute passed before he finally asked his first question. "When did the first error appear?" A systems analyst answered immediately. 9:17 this morning." Ethan nodded. "And when did you begin trying to repair it?" 9:19. Ethan looked toward another monitor. "Did anyone compare the first failure to the recovery attempts?" The room became silent. One engineer admitted, "We focused on restoring service as quickly as possible." Ethan smiled gently. "That is what caring people do. Unfortunately, computers reward patience more than urgency." Richard Nolan folded his arms with a knowing expression. He had heard almost those exact words years earlier. Ethan continued studying the displays before asking another quiet question. "May I see the original event logs instead of the filtered reports?" A technician quickly opened another window. Thousands of entries streamed across the screen. Ethan leaned forward slightly. His eyes never moved quickly. They moved carefully. Finally, he pointed toward a single timestamp buried beneath pages of data. There. Nobody immediately understood what he had found. The chief technology officer adjusted his glasses and looked closer. "That cannot be the source. It is only a minor synchronization delay." Ethan nodded politely. "By itself, yes. But systems behave like families. One small misunderstanding rarely causes the greatest problem. It is the chain of quiet reactions afterward that changes everything." Several engineers looked at one another before beginning to trace the sequence manually. 30 seconds later, surprise spread across the room. Every major failure originated from the exact timestamp Ethan had identified within moments of entering the room. Nobody spoke. The only sound came from keyboards clicking rapidly as the team verified the discovery. Charlotte watched Ethan instead of the monitors. He showed no pride, no satisfaction, and no desire to prove anyone wrong. He simply stood with his hands resting loosely at his sides, as though solving difficult problems had always been less important to him than helping the people standing beside them understand why those problems existed in the first place. Then the chief technology officer slowly looked up from his screen, his voice barely above a whisper. "He found in 2 minutes what 40 of us missed in almost an hour." The room remained almost perfectly still as engineers quietly retraced every step Ethan had pointed out. One by one, confirmation replaced doubt. The synchronization delay had never been the real failure. It had simply been the first whisper before a much larger echo spread through the system. Ethan stepped back from the display, giving the team room to work instead of taking control. You already know how to solve this, he said calmly. You only needed to begin at the beginning instead of the ending. The chief technology officer looked at him with genuine disbelief. If it were that simple, why did none of us see it? Ethan smiled with quiet kindness. Because you were trying to save the company. Pressure makes even brilliant people run past the smallest details. Richard Nolan chuckled softly. That is exactly how he used to teach us. Several younger engineers exchanged surprised glances. They had expected arrogance from someone whose reputation suddenly seemed almost mythical. Instead, the quiet visitor spoke to everyone with patience, never making anyone feel small. Charlotte watched the room carefully. She noticed something changing that had nothing to do with software. Fear was slowly giving way to confidence. The engineers no longer sounded defensive. They were asking questions, sharing ideas, and listening to one another again. Ethan pointed toward a sequence on the largest monitor. Restore only the original authentication pathway. Leave everything else untouched for now. One engineer hesitated. That will temporarily reduce processing speed. Ethan nodded. A steady bridge carries more people than a fast bridge with cracks. The command was entered. For several long seconds, every eye remained fixed on the system dashboard. Then one warning icon disappeared. Another followed. Network traffic stabilized across one region. A technician sitting near the back suddenly smiled. West Coast servers are responding again. Another voice immediately followed. Central region is recovering. More green indicators appeared across the display until the room that had been filled with flashing alerts only minutes earlier began returning to normal. Nobody cheered. They simply stared in quiet relief. The silence somehow carried more emotion than applause ever could. Charlotte looked toward Ethan. He had already turned away from the monitors and was gently straightening one of the conference room chairs that had been pushed out of place during the morning's rush. It was such a simple gesture that several people almost missed it. Even after solving the problem that threatened a multi-billion-dollar demonstration, he still noticed the little things. Richard walked over and placed a hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder. You have not changed. Ethan gave a humble shrug. Life changes all of us. Richard smiled. Not the important parts. Before anyone could say another word, the executive assistant entered once more, this time wearing a relieved expression instead of panic. Miss Hayes, the investors have arrived early. They are already gathering in the presentation hall. Charlotte glanced at the restored dashboard before looking back at Ethan. Would you stay for the demonstration? Ethan immediately shook his head with polite sincerity. I think my interview is probably over. I should not keep human resources waiting. A few engineers lowered their eyes, embarrassed by the thought that only an hour earlier this remarkable man had been sitting downstairs hoping for a janitor's position. Charlotte stepped closer, her voice warm but steady. Mr. Brooks, I do not believe you understand. The interview ended the moment I recognized your name. What happens next is something the entire company needs to see. The presentation hall overlooked the Chicago skyline through towering glass windows that reflected the bright afternoon sun across polished oak floors. Investors, board members, department directors, and senior executives settled into their seats while quiet conversations filled the room with measured confidence. Only a handful of people knew how close the company had come to disaster less than an hour earlier. Charlotte Hayes stepped onto the stage with the calm presence that had earned the trust of shareholders around the world. Behind her, the enormous display screen came to life, showing every system operating smoothly once again. A ripple of relieved smiles spread across the audience. The demonstration proceeded flawlessly. Every transition responded instantly. Every data stream appeared exactly as planned. When the final presentation concluded, respectful applause echoed through the hall. One investor stood and smiled. Miss Hayes, your engineering team deserves tremendous credit. Recovering from unexpected challenges this quickly is remarkable. Charlotte accepted the compliment with a gracious nod, but she did not sit down. Instead, she remained standing behind the podium, her expression becoming noticeably more thoughtful. Thank you, she replied. Our engineering team is extraordinary. But today, someone else reminded us what this company was built upon. Curious whispers moved through the audience. Charlotte looked toward the entrance of the hall, where Ethan stood quietly beside the wall, still wearing the temporary visitor badge issued only hours earlier. He had chosen the farthest corner of the room, hoping not to interrupt the meeting. Charlotte smiled warmly. "Mr. Brooks, would you please join me?" Ethan looked around as though she might be speaking to someone else. Richard Nolan gave him an encouraging nod. Slowly, Ethan walked toward the stage while hundreds of eyes followed him with growing curiosity. Several human resources employees exchanged confused glances. One quietly whispered, "That is the janitor applicant." Charlotte waited until Ethan reached the stage before continuing. "Many of you have spent years benefiting from systems that made Atlas Dynamics one of the most respected technology companies in America." She paused and gently lifted an old employee identification badge from the podium. Very few people know whose ideas became the foundation beneath those systems. The room grew completely still. Charlotte turned toward Ethan with unmistakable respect. 12 years ago, this man quietly designed the architecture that allowed this company to grow far beyond anyone's expectations. He never asked for recognition. He never demanded applause. When his family needed him, he simply walked away because being a husband and father mattered more than titles. Several senior employees slowly lowered their eyes as the realization spread across the room. The same quiet man who had applied for a janitor position that morning had never stopped belonging to the story of Atlas Dynamics. Charlotte continued softly. "Today, while many of us searched for complicated answers, he reminded us that wisdom often begins by looking carefully instead of loudly." No one spoke. The silence carried admiration, humility, and more than a little regret. Ethan stepped toward the microphone only because Charlotte gently invited him to do so. He looked across the audience before offering a small, grateful smile. "I appreciate your kindness," he said. "But companies are never built by one person. They are built by people who choose to help one another, especially when nobody is watching." He handed the microphone back almost immediately. For several heartbeats, the hall remained perfectly quiet. Then one person stood. Richard Nolan began to applaud. Another engineer rose beside him. Soon the entire room stood together, not celebrating a genius, not honoring a title, but recognizing a man whose quiet character had always been greater than his remarkable talent. The applause continued long after Ethan stepped away from the microphone, but he never looked comfortable standing at the center of attention. He simply nodded with quiet gratitude before returning to the side of the stage, where he had felt more at home from the beginning. Charlotte watched the room settle before speaking one final time. "There is one more announcement." The audience grew silent again. Effective immediately, Atlas Dynamics is establishing the Ethan Brooks Fellowship, a program dedicated to mentoring young engineers who demonstrate not only exceptional talent, but exceptional character. Because the future of this company will not be measured only by innovation. It will be measured by integrity. The room answered with another round of heartfelt applause. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "Miss Hayes," he said softly, "that is far more than I deserve." Charlotte smiled. "Respect is never charity, Mr. Brooks. Sometimes it is simply overdue." After the meeting concluded, employees who had passed Ethan in the hallway without a second glance now approached him one by one. Some thanked him for saving the demonstration. Others apologized for judging him before knowing anything about him. Ethan accepted every handshake with the same gentle humility. He never reminded anyone of their earlier comments. He never made anyone feel ashamed. Grace had always come more naturally to him than pride. Before leaving the building, Charlotte caught up with him in the lobby where their conversation had first begun that morning. She held a neatly prepared folder in her hands. "This contains an executive employment offer," she explained. "Senior strategic architect. Complete authority to rebuild our engineering vision. The compensation package includes everything you could possibly need." Ethan accepted the folder respectfully, but did not open it. After a thoughtful moment, he handed it back. Charlotte looked at him with quiet surprise. "May I ask why?" Ethan smiled, and for the first time that day his eyes carried the warmth of someone already thinking about home. "Because in about 40 minutes, my daughter will be waiting outside her school with her backpack that is almost bigger than she is. She expects me to be there. I have already missed too many moments in life that no promotion could ever replace." Charlotte lowered the folder slowly, understanding completely. "Then what would you accept?" Ethan thought for only a second. "The janitor position is still available, is it not?" She laughed through eyes that had become unexpectedly emotional. "After everything that happened today, you still want that job? It offers honest work, steady hours, health insurance, and enough time to walk Lily home every afternoon. Right now, that sounds like success to me. Charlotte nodded with deep respect. Then you have the job. On one condition. Ethan tilted his head slightly. You agree to spend one morning each month mentoring our engineers. They need your wisdom as much as your experience. Ethan extended his hand. That seems fair. As the autumn sun settled across the city, Ethan walked out of Atlas Dynamics carrying no executive contract, no title, and no celebration trophy. He carried only a small employee packet for a custodial position and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he would arrive at Lily's school exactly on time. Upstairs, Charlotte placed Ethan's temporary visitor badge inside a simple frame and set it on the bookshelf behind her desk. Whenever new executives asked about it in the years that followed, she would simply smile and say, "Never judge the value of a person by the job they asked for today." Sometimes the strongest foundation in the room belongs to the quietest soul. And from that day forward, everyone who entered Atlas Dynamics learned something no balance sheet could ever measure. Titles may open doors, but character is what leaves them open for others.